Looking out toward the distant border and down at the neighborhood street reveals two very different versions of national survival. Writing for War on the Rocks on June 19th, Rajeswari Pillai Rajagopalan presents a case for strategic alignment, suggesting that India's safety against regional hegemony depends on a firm partnership with the United States. It's an argument built on the hard realities of geography. Yet, just 2 days later in Scroll.in, harsh Mander turns toward the internal, finding strength in quiet acts of faith and communal forgiveness. There's a striking friction here. It's worth pausing on whether security is won through global alliances or through the small, daily choices that keep a society from fracturing.
Rajeswari Pillai Rajagopalan, writing this past June, examines why New Delhi remains remarkably calm despite the Liberation Day tariffs and erratic diplomacy coming from Washington. Notice how she frames Prime Minister Modi's ego massaging of the American president as a calculated, realist necessity. The piece argues that the partnership persists because India lacks any other viable counter to a rising China, making the alliance an absence of choice rather than a preference.
Join War on the Rocks and gain access to content trusted by policymakers, military leaders, and strategic thinkers worldwide. The Trump administration has not been kind to India. Nevertheless, India has responded with far greater equanimity than most observers expected. Predictions that President Donald Trump's behavior will hurt U.S.-Indian relations have not come to pass, with the leaders of the two countries remaining in frequent and friendly conversation. Instead of retaliating, India has responded calmly, though the Indian government faces considerable domestic criticism. Despite continuing irritation with American behavior, India can be expected to maintain its 2-decade course of seeking good relations with the United States. The reason is a simple one that is ignored by critics and analysts. India has no other choice. India faces a China that is growing ever more powerful and aggressive, and one with which India has both political and territorial disputes. China is India's overriding strategic concern, and it will remain so for the foreseeable future. India's many other partners are useful supplements, but they cannot replace American heft. As offensive as Trump's behavior has been, New Delhi needs Washington's support to deal with Beijing. This may change if American unreliability becomes embedded rather than simply being, as the Indian government no doubt hopes, a Trumpian interlude. Until then, India's partnership with the United States is not a matter of choice, but an absence of choice. The situation looked a lot more promising when Trump won the U.S. presidential election in 2024. There was a considerable confidence in New Delhi about the future of the relationship in the second Trump term.
Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's welcoming of his friend Trump's spectacular victory was probably understandable because he was far from alone in recognizing that Trump required over-the-top ego massaging. But there was also genuine hope at both the popular and elite levels about Trump, and the optimism seemed well-founded. Indian Foreign Minister Subramanyam Jaishankar was given a front-row seat at the Trump inauguration, and Modi himself made an early visit to meet Trump just weeks after the inauguration. The good vibrations came to a screeching halt when Trump imposed tariffs on India in April 2025 as part of his Liberation Day tariffs. But that was not the end of it. A month later, he was claiming credit for stopping an Indian-Pakistani military clash that followed a terrorist attack in Indian-controlled Kashmir. Trump was now carelessly undermining the Indian position that it was Pakistan that had sued for peace because of punishing Indian military action. Moreover, for decades, India has maintained that it will not accept third-party mediation in Indian-Pakistani disputes, though this was never entirely true, as the U.S. government had periodically stepped in to calm Indo-Pakistani crises. But previous U.S. presidents had been careful to maintain the fiction of American non-involvement to satisfy India. Trump, of course, was different, and his loud claims forced the Indian government into a quandary. New Delhi was unwilling to reject his claims, lest the mercurial Trump took offense, but not able to accept it either. The mediation claim probably hurt India even more than the tariffs, because the current nationalistic Indian government has been particularly insistent about its forceful defense of Indian territory and sovereignty. Rubbing salt on Indian wounds, Trump invited Pakistan's military chief for an hour-long lunch at the White House, publicly praising him and disagreeing with India about how the Indian-Pakistani war ended. Further blows followed. India faced additional tariffs on importing Russian oil, forcing India to reduce such imports to a 44-month low by January 2026. The U.S.-Israeli war on Iran made things even worse. India's approach was passive, leading to much domestic criticism in India of the government's pusillanimity towards the United States. India was further dismayed by Pakistan's central role in mediating the Iran war. There were even indications of internal disagreements within the Indian government, with Foreign Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar being blamed for Indian diplomatic failures. Despite such carelessness to its interests and pride, an explicitly nationalist Indian government is careful to avoid antagonizing the United States because India has no option other than to balance China. It is important to note that nothing has undermined this central purpose, though a lot of Trump's actions have hurt Indian pride. The imbalance of wealth and power between India and China has grown rapidly. The two were roughly comparable from the 1950s to the 1980s. But by the mid-1990s, China's economic liberalization had already made its economy thrice as large as India, and the gap kept growing. As of 2024, the Chinese economy is about 5 times as large. Though India has itself grown quite rapidly, and its share of the global economy had doubled from 1.6% in 2000 to 3.4% in 2023, it had weakened relative to China. From being about 2/3 the size of China's economy in 1980, it has now declined to less than a fifth.
China is rapidly converting its wealth into military power. For decades, India was proud of deploying the only aircraft carrier in Asia. China now has 3 carriers, all larger than India's 2, with rumors of a 4th nuclear-powered carrier. India produced Asia's first indigenous jet fighter after 1945, but is now largely dependent on imported fighters, while China has at least 2 indigenous 5th-generation combat jets in service. China's industrial manufacturing capacity also makes it a major drone power, while India is far behind. Not surprisingly, Indian leaders see balancing China as their primary strategic problem. When India conducted the 1998 nuclear test, Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee pointed to the China threat as the reason. By 2010, India's army chief was warning for the first time about the possibility of India facing a 2-front war contingency, having to deal with both China and Pakistan at the same time. This was the main reason why both the right-wing Vajpayee and the left-wing Manmohan Singh governments, ideologically radically different, pursued a new relationship with the United States. This was continued by the Modi government. Though Modi initially did also seek more cooperative economic relations with Beijing, repeated Chinese aggressive behavior along the Tibet border meant that there were clear limits to how far engagement would moderate Chinese behavior. After an attack in 2020 cost the lives of 20 Indian soldiers and an unknown number of Chinese, the first blood spilled on the border in decades, India tightened its embrace of the United States and the Quad, a strategic cooperation arrangement between India, the United States, Australia, and Japan.
While, in theory, India has a number of other partnership options, they fall apart under even a cursory examination. For example, a seemingly obvious choice is Russia, India's partner through much of the Cold War, and still a favorite fallback option. In fact, in response to Trump, India signaled this very option with a flurry of official visits in the latter half of last year, capped by a state visit by Russian President Vladimir Putin to India in December, the first in 4 years. But the visit proved to be a lot less significant than promised, especially because expectations of a new oil and arms deal were belied. A weakened Russia, leaning on China, bogged down in Ukraine, and a shadow of its Cold War military technological prowess is not a substitute for the United States. India still buys Russian arms, but this has declined significantly over the past decade. Only a small part of this is New Delhi's concern at being over-dependent on Moscow for arms. Pressure from the United States also possibly plays a small part. The main reason is simply that Russia no longer has the advanced weapons technology India needs. For example, Russia produces no 5th-generation fighter that India can buy as it faces off against an increasingly sophisticated Chinese air power. India had previously invested in the Russian Su-57 fighter, which was supposed to provide such capability,
but pulled out of the partnership after it became clear that Russia did not have the technology to build what India needed. China fields at least 2 advanced 5th-generation fighter planes, and possibly even a stealth bomber that would be a particular concern to India. Moreover, some of these technologies will likely make their way to Pakistan, China's longtime strategic partner.
Chinese military technology has already made a difference. Several Indian fighter planes were reportedly shot down in the Indian-Pakistani military confrontation in May 2025 by a combination of advanced Chinese fighter jets and long-distance air-to-air missiles, which took the Indian Air Force by surprise. Another major strategic hurdle is the growing camaraderie between Moscow and Beijing. Russia has joined Chinese criticism of the Quad, a group which includes India. Most critically, Russia's failure to support India during the India-China border clash in 2020 means that New Delhi knows it cannot depend on Moscow in any future China confrontation. India is unlikely to entirely abandon the Russia relationship, but the Indian establishment knows that Moscow is not the answer to India's China problem. Another alternative India has is to partner with Indo-Pacific powers, such as Australia, Japan, and others, all of whom fear the consequences of China's growing power and share a common experience of recent Chinese aggression. Japan has repeatedly faced Chinese incursions into its territory in the East China Sea, as well as other belligerent military behavior, including exercises. In late 2025, a Chinese naval task force engaged in an unprecedented circumnavigation of Australia, staying just outside of Australian territorial waters. This is in addition to previous efforts at economic coercion of these countries, as well as China's assertive use of force in the South China Sea and against Taiwan. Not surprisingly, even if reluctantly, the countries in the region have responded.
Japan and Australia have already been ramping up their own efforts to counter the threat from China, both by increasing their own domestic military efforts, as well as by strengthening existing partnerships. For example, Japan's military spending has long since left the 1% of GDP limit. Including supplemental funding, it has already crossed the 2% of GDP threshold. Australia is the latest country in the region to hike its defense spending, with the defense minister justifying it as necessary to meet, quote, the most threatening strategic circumstances since the end of World War II. Others in the region, such as South Korea, have also sharply increased their defense spending. The region is also building local partnerships, leaning on each other for support. Australia and Japan have significantly deepened their bilateral defense ties, including with a reciprocal access agreement. Earlier this year, Australia signed a security treaty with Indonesia. Even Japan and South Korea, despite a troubled legacy, are enhancing their defense cooperation. Beyond the region, both the Quad and the Australia-United Kingdom-United States AUKUS alliance are examples of countries in the region building partnerships for security. The region thus represents a potential partnership opportunity for India, which it has pursued. Still, a number of practical difficulties hinder any such partnership. First, though the common concern is China's enormous power disparity, the specific ways in which this manifests are different for each country. India worries about China's territorial claims along the land border, while Japan is concerned primarily with its maritime territories, especially the Senkaku Islands. Australia's problem is not territorial at all, but about sea lanes of communication. Second, the forms of cooperation. Japan and Australia have long habit of security cooperation, but India remains suspicious of actual security venture. And of course, burden sharing in any such cooperative venture will prove to be a difficult conversation if these countries ever get to that point. But the most fundamental problem is the most serious. Even together, these three are no match for China. Their combined GDP is only about half of China, calculated from World Bank GDP data for 2024, current US dollars. Not surprisingly, China's defense budget of about $336 billion, which likely understates its actual spending, towers above the $190 billion that these three powers can contribute together, calculated from Stockholm International Peace Research Institute data. The truth is that even together, assuming all coordination problems are resolved, such a partnership is simply insufficient to balance China by itself. Other partnership options are even less viable. European powers are too far away, too weak, and too disorganized to be of much help against China. The BRICS economic bloc,
comprised of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has grown but is divided and more likely to follow China's lead than India's. India is not likely to abandon any of these partnerships, but they will remain as supplements rather than a replacement for the United States. Moreover, such partnerships allow India to potentially reduce its dependence on the United States, which addresses India's desire to maintain some strategic autonomy, but they work only if America is available to depend upon. A final alternative that India has is resolving its difficulties with China, if not ultimately aligning itself more closely with Beijing.
After all, India and China agree on a lot, which is one reason why India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, tried hard to build a partnership with the giant neighbor, a policy that came to be called Hindi Chini Bye Bye. India and China are brothers. Moreover, Indian leaders always recognized that enmity with China would force India into an uncomfortable dependence on other powers. This was the main reason why Prime Minister Indira Gandhi sought to improve relations with China by the end of the 1960s, despite suffering a grievous defeat at China's hands just a few years earlier. Similarly, over the last year, as India grew increasingly worried about President Trump's actions, it began to improve relations with Beijing, sending senior ministers on visits, freeing up business travel, and reducing curbs on Chinese investments. But despite these small steps, there is no indication that India has any China card that it can play. The problem New Delhi faces is that Beijing shows little sign that it is interested in any fundamental reset of its India relations. To the extent that ties are warming, it is being dictated by China. Moreover, India has little idea of what drives China's behavior, including its aggression at the border, such as at Depsang in 2013, Chumar in 2014, Doklam in 2017, and most seriously at Galwan in 2020, the attack that killed 20 Indian soldiers. The Sino-Indian border problem is itself well-nigh impossible to resolve because they involve large swaths of territory, not mere adjustment of a borderline, as well as questions of territorial sovereignty and national identity. Another stumbling block is China's long-standing partnership with Pakistan, India's regional nemesis, which shows no sign of weakening. Thus, by default, India is left with the United States as the only viable strategic choice, because only America is strong enough to balance China. Moreover, American self-interest makes it necessary to counter China. It is, of course, always possible that the United States eventually turns out to be not a real choice. This could happen if, for example, U.S. domestic politics makes the country a less willing international partner. American power is useless to India if the United States no longer wants to wield it to balance China. The American public has indeed become weary about the costs of the country's internationalist policy. The wild swings in Trump's foreign policy, seemingly driven more by personal moods than even transactionalism, point to the risks that India runs. It is not beyond the scope of possibility that Trump or another American administration would seek an accommodation with Beijing. Should this dire possibility come to pass, Asia would likely fall under China's hegemony, and India and other Indo-Pacific powers would need to learn to live in a very different world. But this is also a highly unlikely outcome, because great powers do not willingly withdraw from regions vital to their power and prosperity. In any case, until such an unlikely denouement comes to pass, India will lean on the American balancer. A less likely possibility for the foreseeable future is that American power itself declines so much that the United States is no longer useful to India. But as long as America is able and appears willing, New Delhi will swallow its pride in its own larger interest. Dr. Rajeswari Pillai Rajagopalan is Resident Senior Fellow at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI.
Previously, she was at the Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi, which she joined after a 5-year stint at the National Security Council Secretariat, 2003 to 2007, Government of India. Dr. Rajagopalan has authored, co-authored, or edited more than a dozen books and reports, including, most recently, Assessing India's Perceptions of China's Nuclear Expansion, U.S. Institute of Peace, 2025, and research essays in journals such as India Review, Strategic Studies Quarterly, Air and Space Power Journal, International Journal of Nuclear Law and Strategic Analysis. She can be followed on X at Raji143. Rajesh Rajagopalan is professor of international politics at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His main areas of research are international relations theory and Indian foreign and security policies. His publications include 3 books: Nuclear South Asia, Keywords and Concepts with Atul Mishra, Fighting Like a Guerrilla, The Indian Army and Counterinsurgency, and Second Strike, Arguments about Nuclear War in South Asia. His research articles, some jointly authored, have appeared in journals such as International Affairs, The Washington Quarterly, Contemporary Security Policy, India Review, Contemporary South Asia, Small Wars and Insurgencies, South Asia, South Asian Survey, and Strategic Analysis. He can be followed on X at rrajagopalanjnu. Image, Prime Minister's Office via Wikimedia Commons.
Rajagopalan leaves the listener with a sense of cold necessity. In this view, India's survival is a game of geography and power, where friction with a leader like Trump is a secondary concern compared to the shadow cast by Beijing. The absence of choice, she describes, is a macro-level reality, a nation forced into a strategic alliance to keep its sovereignty intact. But notice how this focus on external security assumes a stable, functioning society back home. Harsh Mander, up next, turns the gaze from the border to the street. Where Rajagopalan sees a state balancing against global hegemony, Mander sees a society losing its grip on the basic mechanics of mercy. The interesting thing is that while Rajagopalan worries about the heft of the United States, Mander suggests the real weight of the nation rests on something far more fragile: the ability of a bridegroom or a neighbor to exist without the threat of a mob. Read alongside Rajagopalan, Mander's piece raises a haunting possibility. If the internal civilizational crisis of communal violence isn't mended, even the most strategic alliance starts to look like a roof being built on a crumbling foundation. One writer fears a loss of territory. The other fears a loss of the very soul that makes the territory worth defending.
We are living through profoundly troubled times. So much that is good and precious is badly broken. Kindness, justice, love, courage, caring, compassion, and empathy. There sometimes seems little hope that we can ever mend. Look around us. An unarmed man is lynched to death by a crowd, screaming piteously for hours. Yet we look away. Young couples who dare to cross the borders of religion and caste risk being slaughtered by mobs or even men of their own families in the name of family and community honor. A young girl is gang raped, a schoolboy beaten to death by his schoolmaster, a bridegroom pulled off his wedding horse and killed for the supposed transgression of their caste. In our land, it has become customary for the rest of us to look away as people of Muslim religious identity are being disenfranchised, their houses bulldozed, their worship criminalized, their citizenship rights trampled. Or when targeted people are pushed at gunpoint across international borders or tossed from naval boats into the deep sea. Not just India. Look at the world today. $1 trillion is the wealth of one single man. If he spends $1 million every single day, it would take 2,700 years for his wealth to get exhausted. Yet 1 in 12 people in the world sleep hungry every night. 1 in 2 are denied affordable health care, and 1 in 5 children are malnourished. The most powerful countries in the world support the genocidal slaughter of children, aid workers, doctors, and press persons in Gaza. The most powerful leader in the world speaks nonchalantly of expelling the people of Gaza, people who have lived in that land for thousands of years, to build, in place of the ruins of their devastated homeland, an upmarket Riviera. Each day there are new stories, somber stories of our fraught and pitiless times. Stories of surging hate, fear, and inequality signal nothing short of a civilizational crisis. We must bear public witness to all of this, to burden our public conscience, and call to resist. We must battle hate violence and state injustice in every way that we can. We must fight in the courts, on the streets, and in hearts and minds. Courage and kindness. But despair is not an option. Hope is a public duty. Therefore, we must also realize that this is not enough. We must be mindful that there are other stories as well, all around us. Stories of stout-hearted courage, of aching compassion, of heroic solidarity, of tender forgiveness. Stories that we forget to tell. We must pay heed when historian Howard Zinn reminds us that human history is not just a history of cruelty and oppression. It is also the story of kindness and courage. And what we emphasize in this complex history of ours will in the end determine what we become. We must realize, therefore, that while it is imperative to bear witness to the hate and injustice that crushes us, it is profoundly important also to recognize and celebrate acts of courage and kindness. These acts are what I call radical love, a love so robust that I am prepared to go to prison, even to endanger my life, to protect and defend the other who is persecuted. We most often don't notice these acts of courage and kindness. We rarely celebrate them. The idea grew among us for a series of local celebrations of acts of kindness and courage, of radical love, of crowdsourcing such stories, of building maybe even a movement of love. It is this that will give us hope. It will heal. It will mend. It will illuminate the path ahead. Rahmat festivals. The name we coined for these celebrations of radical love and courageous kindness is Rahmat, which in Urdu means compassion, kindness, caring. The core idea of the Rahmat initiative is to identify and publicly honor people who stand tall against hate violence, people who demonstrate courageous kindness and radical love. These are people who bravely act to prevent communal, caste, and gender violence, people who rescue and shelter persecuted persons, people who save lives. People who fight great odds, like mob hate, fury, state persecution, or their own deprivations, to defend, protect, and care for individuals who are in danger, who are oppressed, who are suffering. In brief, individuals who stand up against the forces of hate. We agreed that this should not be one event, but an ongoing series in many parts of the country, and that we should try to crowdsource also the identifying of such acts of courageous kindness. We hope the idea can grow incrementally. Starting in Hyderabad. We needed to start somewhere. A wonderful group of friends in Hyderabad offered to host the first Rahmat festival in the country, one we hope would be only one of ever more stories, ever more festivals to honor people who have demonstrated courageous kindness. Humaira Ahmed and Ashar Farhan offered the beautiful space they created 16 years ago called Lama Khan for the festival. They were joined by Ilahi Hiptullah, Salima Razvi, Azam Khan, Asiya Ahmed Khan, and Amirullah Khan. This band of 7 friends joined hands to create our first luminously beautiful celebration of courageous kindness. Our task in the Karwan-e-Mohabbat was to identify the heroes who we would honor. For this, we reached the mountains of Kashmir, the lacerated combat zones of Manipur, and the bitterly divided lands of Muzaffarnagar in Uttar Pradesh, Mustafabad in northeast Delhi, and coastal Karnataka. My colleagues spoke with each of the protagonists of courageous kindness over many days, explained to them what we were trying to do and why, and invited them for the Rahmat celebration in Hyderabad. There was hesitation, some shyness. Then they agreed. Tickets were bought, and the program was fixed for June 13 and 14 at Lama Khan, Hyderabad. Some adventures ensued in their journeys to Hyderabad. Haider Shah, the father of Adil Hussain Shah, the heroic pony operator in Pahalgam who had given his life to defend the tourists targeted by terrorists in Pahalgam and Kashmir in April 2025, had not all his life stepped out of Kashmir or entered an airplane or train. My colleague Muhammad Amir Khan was with him on the phone at every step, gently guiding him through puzzling procedures like the airport security and check-in. Nyaine Kim Lumkim, the Kuki peace worker from Manipur, could not take the 1-hour road journey to Impal to catch her flight because it is unsafe for Kukis to enter Impal. Instead, she had to take a 10-hour mountainous road journey to Aizawl to take the plane to Hyderabad. At Hyderabad, a team of young volunteers received each of the guests and took them to see the city. My Hyderabad friends invited them by turns to their homes. On Sunday, Nyaine Kim went to pray at a church,
Imam Rashidi and Haider Shah at a mosque, and Mohinder Singh at a gurudwara. Over the few days, this unusual collection of heroes built bonds with each other. While parting, there were tears. They formed a WhatsApp group to remain in contact with each other.
Haider Shah. The first evening at La Makan began with Haider Shah, the father of Syed Adil Hussein Shah, the 28-year-old pony operator in Pahalgam who was shot dead while trying to save the lives of the innocent tourists last April by grappling with a terrorist and trying to snatch his rifle. His father spoke to us with great dignity and conviction, in simple words. He spoke of how much he loved and missed his eldest son, who was also the principal breadwinner of the family, but that he was happy that his son did what he did. He did this for humanity. This is what his culture, religion, and love for his country had taught him. He misses his son each day, but is proud of him. Himanshi Narwal. Next, Lalita Ramdas accepted the award for Himanshi Narwal, the extraordinary young woman who lost her naval officer husband to the bullets of a terrorist during their honeymoon in Pahalgam, and made a passionate call against hate, violence, and revenge. Lalita Ramdas is the daughter of India's first naval chief and wife of the 13th naval chief. She read out a letter she had written after as a personal tribute, from possibly one of the oldest Navy daughters' wives alive to the newest and youngest among the special fraternity of naval wives. She wrote, "I am so proud of you as I watch the clip of your words to the press over and over again. Your extraordinary strength, composure, and conviction when you speak out against hate and targeting of Muslims and Kashmiris after the horrific killing of so many innocent men in Pahalgam on the 22nd is truly remarkable." She added, "You have echoed the thoughts and feelings of every thinking citizen of this country, and we should all take your message of love and compassion far and wide." Imam Rashidi. Next came Imam Rashidi. I recalled for the gathering how in 2018, after a communal skirmish had broken out in Asansol in West Bengal, 2 Hindu children were trapped in the Muslim-dominant segment of the city, and 1 Muslim child was caught in the Hindu area. Negotiations began for an exchange of the trapped children. But Imam Rashidi intervened and insisted that the Hindu children be safely returned to their parents, with no conditionalities. After the Hindu children were restored, they waited for the Muslim child. This Muslim child was the Imam's own son. Near midnight, the police reported to the Imam that the boy had been tortured and killed. Had the Imam not intervened, the city would have burned in a frenzy of revenge. But the Imam appealed to the Muslims, saying, "The death of my son is a great tragedy for me, but it would be an even greater tragedy if a single Hindu was harmed in revenge." I recalled going to Asansol just days later with a Karwan-e-Mohabbat team. Young Muslim men told me that instead of the retributive violence that they would have unleashed, they formed groups to protect the Hindus in their part of the city. There were more Hindus than Muslims at the boy's funeral, and peace returned to the city. As I spoke, the Imam's eyes welled up with tears. He said this was the first time after 5 years that he had broken down in public. He spoke of why he had chosen this path of peace after he cruelly lost his son. "This is what my religion, Islam, has taught me," he quietly affirmed. Nai Nakim. Next came Nai Nakim, the president of the Kuki Women's Human Rights Association. The day when violence broke out on May 3rd, 2023, she was at her daughter's clinic. Some Meitei men ran a gun shop just across the road from the clinic. When a mob of Kuki men descended on the shop to kill the Meitei men and loot the guns, she stood between the mob and the men and helped them escape to the police station. She returned to the clinic to find that 2 terrified Meitei men had hidden themselves there, and they begged her to save their lives. She locked them inside the clinic, and at 3 a.m, she drove to the clinic on her scooter and transported them to the police station. The next day, she called upon all the members of the Kuki women's group to save their Meitei members. The women formed a human chain between the armed Kuki mobsters and the Meitei men to ensure their passage to safety. Gai Nikim also spoke of calls that she got from her Kuki relatives who were similarly trapped in the Imphal Valley. She advised them to try to run to the safety of the police station, but they were caught by the mob and killed. She spoke of the great wound this had created in her heart, because no one had rescued the Kuki men in the valley in the way she and other women members had saved Meitei men in the hills. But in Hyderabad, she met Kshetramayam O'Neill,
the Maite peace worker who had saved many Kuki people, and she said that this meeting had healed 70% of the wound that she carried in her heart. Both Ngainikin and O'Neill spoke of how it would have been impossible for them to meet in the violently divided Manipur. But in Hyderabad, it was as though Ngainikin had found a brother in O'Neill. They both wept as they sat together on the dais. Kshetramayam O'Neill. The next evening began with listening to the story of Kshetramayam O'Neill. O'Neill is a prominent human rights and peace worker of Manipur who worked in the past with Amnesty, Oxfam, and Greenpeace.
He recalled working in relief camps with victim survivors of the Gujarat communal carnage in 2002-2003. It took a lot of courage to do what O'Neill did after combat broke out in Manipur in 2023. Even as heavily armed militant groups of his own Métis community roamed the streets with light machine guns, killing, looting, and burning Kuki-Zo people, properties, and churches, he rescued and evacuated Kuki-Zo children, women, and men to the Manipur Rifle Station. He continued to supply them food, clothes, and provisions in the temporary camp that was set up at Manipur Rifles before they were taken to the Kuki-Zo regions of the hills. Despite threats by the militant groups, he persists in calling for dialogue and peace in Manipur. He spoke to us of the need to build a Manipur that is safe for people of every ethnicity and religion. Sunny Sharma. Sunny Sharma owns a mobile phone shop in his village Lisad in Shamli district, formerly part of Muzaffarnagar district, and is an influential member of the local Kap Panchayat. He recalled how in 2013, when communal violence broke out, he rescued his shop assistant, a young Muslim worker Nadeem, and his mother and sister by hiding them in his home. He ferried many others to safety as well on his motorcycle, defying the violent mobs of armed young men who tried to block his path. His friend, Bublu, joined him by transporting many people on his tractor to his poultry farm, where they stood guard with local country pistols, until they could take them to the safety of government relief camps. In the camps, Sunny Sharma would supply food rations and clothes to Muslim people of his village. He persuaded many terrified former residents to return to their village, and he helped them rebuild their homes and livelihoods. In the meeting in Hyderabad, he spoke caustically about the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the parent organization of the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party, and its role in dividing their society with hate. There are 36 communities in western Uttar Pradesh. Muslims are one among them. We have always lived together with peace. We will not allow the RSS to tear us apart. Abdul Bashir, Naushad, Abdul Bashir's brother, was honored on behalf of the family of Abdul Bashir. In 2018, a young Bajrang Dal activist, Deepak Rao, was brutally killed in Mangalore. In retribution, local Hindutva activists chose to kill Abdul Bashir, a 48-year-old who had returned after working for 25 years in the Gulf and now ran a fast food outlet. It was around 10 at night when he was pulling down the shutters that 4 men assaulted him and ran away. It was a dark and isolated part of the city, and he lay bleeding when 15 minutes later, an ambulance driver found him and rushed him to a local hospital, where he died. A large, restive crowd gathered outside the hospital, and the city was on edge, fearing another retaliatory killing. Activists wanted to take his body in a procession through the city and organize a grand funeral. But Abdul Bashir's family firmly declined. They spoke through the media that Bashir would never have wanted his killing to spark more violence. They quietly shifted the body to a mosque near their home, and the funeral was restricted to the family. But large numbers of people, Hindus and Christians outnumbering Muslim residents, lined up to pay homage to his body. The family in this way halted the cycle of retaliatory violence. Mohinder Singh. The Rahmat Festival in Hyderabad concluded with honoring Mohinder Singh, a Sikh local leader who, with his son Inderjeet Singh, rescued around 70 to 80 Muslim women, children, and men during the 2020 communal carnage in Delhi. A mob gathered to destroy a mosque close to their home, the Jannati Masjid. When they learned that Muslims had hidden in the mosque, they went into the mosque through a back door and smuggled them to their home, at great risk to their own lives. Mohinder Singh kept speaking of how supportive his wife and daughter-in-law were of their rescue efforts. They tied turbans on the heads of the Muslim men, disguising them as Sikhs. Inderjeet Singh also sheltered around 30 Muslims in his home. When the violence began to ebb, both father and son made around 20 trips on their 3-wheelers to transport the people they had sheltered to the relative safety of Kardampuri, a Muslim-majority neighborhood, about a kilometer away. Like Hyder Shah and Imam Rashidi, he too spoke of being inspired by the teachings of his faith to risk his life to save people who were victims of hate violence. They said if you truly followed your religious faith, you could never endure the harm to another in the name of religion. More Rahmat. The Rahmat event was luminous, beautiful beyond imagination. Our friends in Hyderabad and our moderators, Kunal Purohit and Rana Ayub, steered the 2 evenings with feeling and caring, with love, sensitivity, respect, and grace. Singer Anuj Gawara and his band rounded off the festival with some old Hindi songs. They sang the lyrics of the Sahir Ludhianvi classic, "Tu Hindu banega, na Musalman banega. Insan ki aulad hai, insan banega."
As our heroes spoke during the festival, I could see that there was not an eye that was not moist in the audience, not a heart that was not full. Our guests inspired every one of us. Their words assured us that there is still goodness in our society, that we are not yet fully broken as a people, and that we can rebuild our humanity again. I hope that this is only the first of many Rahmat celebrations. By affirming our capacities for kindness and courage in the midst of tempests of hate, I see in these the potential to become essential to our robust resistance to the politics of hate, to the ways our country and world are being radicalized, coarsened, and diminished with hate and fear. These are forms of citizen resistance for taking back our country and world of love, justice, fraternity, and equality. Harsh Mander is a peace and justice worker and writer. He leads Karwan-e-Mohabbat, a people's campaign for solidarity and justice for the survivors of lynching and hate violence. He is visiting faculty in the South Asia Institute of Heidelberg University. His latest book, Under Gray Smoggy Skies, Living Homeless on the Streets of Delhi Cities, is in the bookstores.
What lingers is the friction between a defense pact and the daily peace of a neighborhood. One vision secures the Himalayan borders with drones, while the other tries to keep a single street from catching fire. It's a struggle to decide if safety is found in a carrier strike group or in the quiet trust of a local market. How does a nation measure its strength when the external threat and the internal rift grow at the exact same speed?